Welcome to Sleepless History. I'm your host, and tonight we're going to take a long, peaceful journey through the vast and intricate history of Russia. This is a place where you can simply listen, let your mind wander, and allow the gentle rhythm of historical narrative to carry you into restful sleep. There's no need to remember everything, no quiz at the end. Just relax, get comfortable, and let the story unfold at its own leisurely pace. The history of Russia is one of the longest and most complex stories in human civilization. It spans over 1,000 years, covering vast territories from the forests of Eastern Europe to the frozen reaches of Siberia, from ancient tribes to mighty empires. Tonight, we'll walk through this history slowly and methodically, taking our time with each era, each transition, each quiet moment of change. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin our journey into the deep past of the Russian lands. The ancient lands, before Russia existed. Long before there was anything called Russia, the lands that would eventually bear that name were home to various peoples and tribes. The vast stretches of the Eastern European plain, with its endless forests, winding rivers, and open steppes, provided a home for human communities going back thousands of years. In the centuries before the Common Era, various Indo-European and other groups inhabited these regions. The Sumerians roamed the steppes north of the Black Sea around the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. They were eventually displaced by the Scythians, a nomadic people known for their horsemanship and their elaborate golden artwork. The Scythians dominated the Pontic steppe from roughly the 7th century until the 3rd century before the Common Era. These were not settled agricultural societies in the way we might imagine ancient civilizations. Instead, they were pastoral nomads, moving with their herds across the grasslands, living in portable dwellings, and following the rhythms of the seasons. Their culture left behind remarkable archaeological finds, particularly the frozen tombs of Scythian nobles in the Altai Mountains, where the permafrost preserved textiles, tattooed skin, and other organic materials that normally would have decayed long ago. After the Scythians came the Sarmatians, another Iranian-speaking nomadic people who gradually took control of the western steppes. The Sarmatians were known for their heavily armoured cavalry, and they maintained dominance in the region for several centuries around the beginning of the Common Era. Meanwhile, to the north, in the forests and forest steppes, various Baltic, Finnic, and early Slavic peoples lived in smaller tribal communities. These forest dwellers practiced a mix of agriculture, hunting, and fishing. Their lives were closely tied to the natural cycles of the forest, the rivers that served as their highways, and the clearings where they planted their crops. The Slavic peoples, who would eventually become so important to the story of Russia, began to expand and differentiate during the early centuries of the Common Era. Linguistic and archaeological evidence suggests that the early Slavs originated somewhere in the region between the Oder and Dnieper rivers. By the 5th and 6th centuries, Slavic groups were migrating in various directions, spreading across Eastern Europe. These migrations were part of the larger movements of peoples during what is sometimes called the Migration Period, a time of tremendous upheaval across Europe and Asia. Germanic tribes moved westward and southward, pressuring the Roman Empire. Hunnic peoples swept across the steppes from the east. In this tumultuous environment, Slavic groups gradually moved into new territories, establishing themselves in the forests and river valleys of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Eastern Slavs, as these groups came to be known, lived in tribal confederations. They built villages of wooden houses, cleared forest land for their fields, and raised livestock. They worshipped various gods associated with thunder, the sun, fertility, and the natural world. Their society was organized around kinship groups and local leaders, without the centralized authority that would come later. Life in these early Eastern Slavic communities followed patterns that had existed for generations. The year was divided by agricultural tasks, preparing the fields in spring, tending crops in summer, harvesting in autumn, and enduring the long, dark winters. Rivers like the Dnieper, the Volga, and the Don served as crucial transportation routes, connecting communities and enabling trade. By the 8th and 9th centuries, these Eastern Slavic tribes included groups with names recorded in later chronicles: the Polyaenians around Kiev, the Drevlians to the west, the Severians to the northeast, the Rhythmics and Viatici further east, and many others. Each tribe had its own territory, its own customs, and its own leaders. But change was coming to these quiet forest lands. New forces were stirring, forces that would transform these scattered tribal communities into something much larger and more complex. Trade routes were developing, connecting the Baltic Sea to the Byzantine Empire far to the south. Warriors and merchants were moving along these routes, bringing new ideas, new technologies, and new forms of organization. And from the north, from Scandinavia, came another group of people who would play a crucial role in the formation of what we now call Russia, the Vikings, or, as they were known in the East, the Varangians. The Varangians and the birth of Rus. In the 9th century, Scandinavian Vikings began to venture eastward in increasing numbers. While their western cousins raided and eventually settled in Britain, Ireland, and France, these eastern Vikings followed the rivers of Eastern Europe southward, seeking trade opportunities and sometimes conquest. These Norsemen, called Varangians in the east, were skilled sailors and warriors. They used rivers as highways, portaging their boats between different river systems, gradually making their way from the Baltic down toward the Black Sea and the rich Byzantine Empire beyond. Along the way, they encountered the Eastern Slavic tribes. The relationship between the Varangians and the Slavs is a subject of much historical debate, but the traditional account, as recorded in the primary chronicle, a later medieval text, tells a particular story. According to this chronicle, sometime around 862, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the northwestern region invited a Varangian chief named Rurik to come and rule over them, to bring order to their lands. Whether this invitation was truly as voluntary as the chronicle suggests, or whether it represented a conquest softened by later chroniclers, is unclear. What is clear is that Varangian leaders did establish themselves as rulers over the Slavic towns along the trade routes. Rurik allegedly made his seat at Novgorod, a town in the northwest. After Rurik's death, his kinsman Oleg took control. Around 882, Oleg moved southward and captured Kiev, a strategically important town on the Dnieper River. He made Kiev his capital, and from there he began to bring the surrounding Slavic tribes under his control, demanding tribute and military service. This marks the traditional founding of what historians call Kievan Rus, the first real state formation in the Eastern Slavic lands. The name Rus itself is somewhat mysterious in origin, but it likely derives from the Scandinavian word for rowers or seafarers, reflecting the Varangian origins of the ruling dynasty. Kiev's location was perfect for trade. The Dnieper River provided a route from the Baltic to the Black Sea, connecting the Scandinavian world to Byzantium. Merchants could travel from the cold northern forests to the warm shores of the Mediterranean, carrying furs, honey, wax, and slaves southward, and bringing back silk, spices, wine, and precious metals. Oleg, according to the chronicles, launched campaigns against Byzantium, showing both the military power of this new state and its ambitions. In 907, he allegedly led a fleet to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, and negotiated a favourable trade treaty. Whether the details are accurate or embellished, it's clear that Kievan Rus quickly became a significant regional power. After Oleg came Igor, and after Igor came his widow Olga, who served as regent for their young son Sviatoslav. Olga is particularly notable as one of the first Rus rulers to convert to Christianity, travelling to Constantinople around 955 and receiving baptism there. However, Christianity did not immediately take hold in Rus. Olga's son Sviatoslav remained pagan and focused his efforts on military expansion, campaigning against the Khazars to the east and even briefly attempting to establish himself in Bulgaria. Sviatoslav died in 972, ambushed by nomadic Pechenegs while returning from his Bulgarian campaigns. His skull was reportedly made into a drinking cup by the Pecheneg Khan, a reminder of the violence and uncertainty of the times. After Sviatoslav's death, there was a brief civil war between his sons. Vladimir, one of the sons, eventually emerged victorious around 980, killing his brother Yaropolk and taking control of Kiev. Vladimir would prove to be one of the most important rulers in all of Russian history, though not immediately for his military accomplishments. Vladimir initially was a vigorous pagan, reportedly erecting idols to various Slavic gods in Kiev and conducting religious reforms. But by the end of the 980s, Vladimir made a decision that would transform Rus forever. He chose to adopt Christianity as the official religion of his realm. The exact reasons for Vladimir's conversion are debated. The primary chronicle tells a colourful story about Vladimir sending envoys to investigate different religions, with the beauty of the Byzantine religious services ultimately swaying him. More practical considerations likely played a role: marriage alliance with the Byzantine imperial family, the prestige of Christianity, and the political advantages of aligning with the most powerful Christian state in the region. In 988, Vladimir was baptized, and he ordered the mass baptism of the inhabitants of Kiev in the Dnieper River. Christianity began to spread throughout Rus, though the conversion was gradual, and pagan practices persisted in many areas for generations. Churches were built, priests arrived from Byzantium, and the Byzantine form of Christianity, what we now call Eastern Orthodox Christianity, took root in the Rus lands. The adoption of Christianity brought with it Byzantine culture, art, and learning. The Cyrillic alphabet, created by Byzantine missionaries for Slavic peoples, became the script for the Old Church Slavonic language used in religious texts. Literacy began to spread among the clergy and nobility. Stone churches in the Byzantine style were constructed, their domes and frescoes bringing Mediterranean artistic traditions to the forests of Eastern Europe. Vladimir died in 1015. His son, Yaroslav, known as Yaroslav the Wise, would rule from 1019 to 1054, presiding over what many consider the golden age of Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus at its height. Under Yaroslav the Wise, Kievan Rus reached the peak of its power and cultural development. Yaroslav was a learned ruler who patronized the arts, supported the church, and undertook significant building projects. The most famous of these was the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Kiev, begun around 1037. This magnificent structure, inspired by the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, symbolized both the religious devotion and the architectural ambitions of Kievan Rus. Kiev in this period was a substantial city by European standards, with perhaps 50,000 inhabitants. It had multiple churches, markets, defensive walls, and gates. The Golden Gate of Kiev, another of Yaroslav's projects, served as the main entrance to the city and reflected Byzantine architectural influence. Yaroslav also codified laws in what became known as Russkaya Pravda, one of the earliest written legal codes among the Eastern Slavs. This code regulated various aspects of life, from property rights to punishments for crimes, representing an important step toward a more organized society. The ruling family of Kiev established connections with other European royal houses through marriage. Yaroslav himself was married to Ingigerd, daughter of the Swedish king. His daughters married the kings of France, Hungary, and Norway, while his sons married princesses from Byzantium and elsewhere. These connections show that Kievan Rus was considered a legitimate and important member of the community of European states. But while the reign of Yaroslav represented a high point, the seeds of future problems were already present. The political system of Kievan Rus was fundamentally unstable. The realm was divided among various members of the ruling Rurikid dynasty, with senior princes ruling in Kiev and junior princes governing other important towns like Novgorod, Chernigov, and Pereyaslav. When a grand prince died, a complex system of succession took effect, with younger brothers and nephews moving up the ladder of seniority, often shifting from one town to another. This system led to constant rivalries and conflicts. After Yaroslav's death in 1054, his sons initially tried to rule collectively, but this arrangement soon broke down. Throughout the late 11th and 12th centuries, Kievan Rus was plagued by internecine warfare as different branches of the dynasty fought over the most prestigious seats. Adding to these internal problems were external threats. From the steppe to the south and east came waves of nomadic peoples, first the Pechenegs, then the Polovtsians, who raided Ruslands, disrupted trade, and sometimes allied with one prince or another in the civil wars. Despite these challenges, Rus culture continued to develop. Monasteries were founded, becoming centers of learning and manuscript production. The most important was the Monastery of the Caves in Kiev, established in the 11th century. Monks there not only copied religious texts, but also began to write chronicles, recording the history of Rus for posterity. The primary chronicle, our main source for early Rus history, was compiled at this monastery in the early 12th century. Art flourished in the form of icon painting, fresco decoration, and manuscript illumination, all following Byzantine models but gradually developing distinctive local characteristics. Architecture continued to develop, with each major town building its own stone churches and fortifications. Trade remained important, though the routes were sometimes disrupted by nomadic raids. Rus exported furs, honey, wax, and other forest products, while importing luxury goods from Byzantium and beyond. Merchants from Scandinavia, Germany, Byzantium, and even further east passed through Rus towns. By the 12th century, however, the political fragmentation of Kievan Rus had become severe. The realm had effectively split into numerous principalities, each ruled by a member of the Rurikid dynasty, but largely independent in practice. Kiev remained symbolically important as the senior city, but its actual power had diminished. Some of these principalities became quite powerful in their own right. Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, under princes like Yuri Dolgoruki and his son Andrei Bogolyubsky, grew strong and prosperous, benefiting from its distance from the steppe raids and its position on important trade routes. Andrei Bogolyubsky even sacked Kiev in 1169, a shocking event that symbolized the decline of Kiev's authority. Novgorod in the northwest developed its own unique political system with a strong merchant class and a vetch, or assembly, that had significant power. Novgorod became wealthy through trade with the Baltic region and maintained a republican form of government that was unusual for medieval Eastern Europe. Galicia Volhynia in the southwest was another important principality, strategically located between Rus, Poland, and Hungary, and often involved in the complex politics of the region. But as the 13th century dawned, none of these internal developments would matter as much as what was about to arrive from the east, the Mongols. The Mongol Storm. In the early decades of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, had exploded out of the Central Asian steppes, conquering vast territories with astonishing speed. By the early 1220s, Mongol forces had subjugated much of Central Asia and were probing westward. The Rus princes first encountered the Mongols in 1223, when a Mongol reconnaissance force pursuing fleeing Cumans entered the Pontic steppe. Several Rus princes, allied with the Cumans, marched out to meet this new threat. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the combined Rus-Cuman forces were decisively defeated. The Mongol tactics, their discipline, and their composite bows proved overwhelmingly superior. After this victory, the Mongol force withdrew eastward, and for more than a decade, the Rus lands had a reprieve. But the Mongols had not forgotten. In 1237, they returned in overwhelming force. This time, the invasion was led by Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, who commanded one of the largest and most formidable armies ever assembled. The Mongol objective was clear: the complete conquest of Eastern Europe. The invasion began in winter 1237 through 1238. The Mongols first attacked the Principality of Ryazan. Despite desperate resistance, Ryazan fell after a siege, and its population was slaughtered. The Mongols then moved on to Vladimir Suzdal, the most powerful of the northeastern principalities. Town after town fell to the Mongol onslaught. Vladimir, Suzdal, Rostov, Yaroslavl, Moscow, which was then just a small town, all were captured and often burned. In February 1238, the Mongols caught and destroyed a Rus army at the Battle of the Sit River, killing Grand Prince Yuri of Vladimir. The Mongols seemed unstoppable. Their armies moved with incredible speed. Their intelligence gathering was superb. Their siege techniques were sophisticated, and their willingness to use terror as a weapon was complete. Cities that resisted were often destroyed and their inhabitants killed, while those that surrendered immediately were sometimes spared. After devastating the northeast, the Mongols turned south. In 1240, they returned for a second campaign. This time, Kiev was the main target. After a siege, Kiev fell in December 1240. The ancient capital of Rus, with its churches and palaces, was thoroughly sacked. The city would never fully recover its former glory. The Mongols continued westward into Galicia, Volhynia, Poland, and Hungary, winning battles wherever they went. Europe seemed to lay open before them. But in 1242, news arrived that the great Khan Ugedai had died in distant Mongolia. Batu Khan halted his western advance and eventually returned to the Volga region, where he established his headquarters. The immediate terror of the invasion was over, but for the Ruslands, a new era had begun. The Mongols had not come merely to raid and leave, they had come to stay as overlords. Batu established the Golden Horde, one of the successor khanates to the Mongol Empire, ruling from a capital called Sarai on the lower Volga. The Rus principalities were not directly annexed, but they became vassals of the Golden Horde. Rus princes had to travel to Sarai to receive a yarlik, a patent of authority, confirming them in their positions. They paid heavy tribute to the Mongols and could be summoned to provide military service. This system was maintained through regular Mongol envoys, occasional punitive expeditions when tribute was late or rebellion stirred, and the Mongol practice of playing different Rus princes against each other, supporting first one candidate, then another, in succession disputes. The Mongol domination, often called the Mongol Yoke in Russian historiography, would last for about 2.5 centuries. Its effects on Rus society were profound. Trade was disrupted, many towns were destroyed or depopulated, and much of the population either fled or was killed. The cultural and economic ties with Byzantium were weakened. Some historians argue that the Mongol period isolated Russia from Western European developments, such as the Renaissance, contributing to a different historical trajectory. Others point out that the Mongol Empire's trade networks and administrative practices had some positive influences, introducing new military techniques, postal systems, and commercial connections across Eurasia. What is clear is that the political landscape changed dramatically. The older principalities were shattered. New centres of power would emerge during the Mongol period, and one in particular would eventually grow strong enough to challenge Mongol rule itself, the Principality of Moscow. The rise of Moscow. Moscow had been a minor settlement before the Mongol invasion, first mentioned in chronicles only in 1147. But in the decades and centuries following the Mongol conquest, this small town on the Moskva River would rise to become the dominant power in the Ruslands. Several factors contributed to Moscow's rise. Its geographic position in the forest zone and relatively protected from direct steppe raids was advantageous. Its location at the intersection of several rivers provided commercial opportunities. But perhaps most importantly, the princes of Moscow proved to be shrewd political operators, skilled at navigating the dangerous waters of serving the Golden Horde while gradually accumulating power. The real founder of Moscow's power was Ivan I, known as Ivan Kelita, which means money bag. Ivan ruled from 1328 to 1340. He cultivated close relations with the Mongols, serving as their chief tax collector among the Rus principalities. This gave him both legitimacy in the eyes of the Mongols and opportunities to enrich himself and his principality. Ivan also secured an important religious advantage. He persuaded the Metropolitan of the Russian Orthodox Church to move his residence from Vladimir to Moscow around 1326. This made Moscow the spiritual center of the Rus lands, a position of immense symbolic importance. Ivan's sons and grandsons continued his policies, gradually expanding Moscow's territory through purchase, marriage alliances, and occasional military action. Moscow absorbed neighbouring principalities, brought rival princes under its control, and steadily grew in power. By the mid-14th century, the Golden Horde was beginning to show signs of internal weakness. The unified Mongol Empire had long since fragmented, and the Golden Horde itself was increasingly riven by succession disputes and civil wars. This internal turmoil provided opportunities for the Rus principalities. In 1380, a major turning point occurred. The Prince of Moscow, Dmitry, later known as Dmitry Donskoy, decided to stop paying tribute to the Mongols and challenge their authority directly. The Mongol commander Mamai assembled a large army to punish this rebellion. The two forces met at Kulikovo Field near the Don River in September 1380. In a hard-fought battle, Dmitry's forces won a significant victory. This was the first major Rus victory over the Mongols in almost a century and a half, and it had enormous psychological impact. It showed that the Mongols could be beaten and that Rus unity under Moscow's leadership could be effective. However, the victory at Kulikovo Field did not immediately end Mongol domination. 2 years later, in 1382, the new Khan Toktamish led a retaliatory expedition, sacked Moscow, and reimposed Mongol overlordship. The Rus principalities would continue to pay tribute for another century, but the balance was gradually shifting. The Golden Horde continued to weaken through internal divisions, eventually splitting into several competing khanates. The Kazan Khanate on the Middle Volga, the Astrakhan Khanate on the Lower Volga, the Crimean Khanate on the Black Sea coast, and the remnant Great Horde. Meanwhile, Moscow continued to strengthen. Under Vasily II, who ruled from 1425 to 1462, Moscow survived a period of civil war and emerged with its power intact. Vasily blinded several rivals and was himself blinded during the conflict, earning him the epithet Vasily the Blind. Despite, or perhaps because of this brutal period, Moscow's dominance over the other Rus principalities was confirmed. The stage was set for the final break with Mongol authority, and that break would come under Vasily's son, Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great. Ivan the Great and the end of the Mongol yoke. Ivan III ruled Moscow from 1462 to 1505, and during his long reign, he transformed Moscow from a significant regional principality into the dominant power of the Ruslands and finally threw off the remnants of Mongol overlordship. Ivan was a cautious but determined ruler. He continued Moscow's policy of territorial expansion, absorbing nearby principalities through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and force. The most important of these acquisitions was the wealthy merchant republic of Novgorod. Novgorod had maintained its independence and its unique republican system throughout the Mongol period, thanks to its northern location and its Baltic trade. But by the late 15th century, Novgorod's position was precarious, caught between the expanding power of Moscow and Lithuania. Ivan conducted several campaigns against Novgorod. In 1471, he forced Novgorod to accept his authority, and in 1478 he annexed it completely, ending its republican institutions and incorporating its vast northern territories into Moscow's domain. Thousands of Novgorod's leading families were forcibly relocated to other parts of Moscow's territories, while Moscow families were settled in Novgorod, ensuring loyalty. Ivan also expanded to the west, fighting a series of wars with Lithuania over the disputed territories of the former Kievan Rus. These wars established Moscow as a major player in Eastern European politics. But Ivan's most important achievement was the final ending of Mongol overlordship. By the 1470s, the Golden Horde had fragmented into several successor states. The Great Horde, led by Khan Akhmat, still claimed authority over the Ruslands and demanded tribute. In 1480, Ivan stopped sending tribute. Khan Akhmat prepared to enforce his authority and marched west with a large army. The two forces met at the Ugra River in the fall of 1480. In what became known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River, the armies faced each other across the river for weeks, neither willing to make the first move. Finally, as winter approached, Khan Akhmat withdrew his forces. He was killed shortly afterward by rivals, and the Great Horde soon collapsed. This anticlimactic confrontation marked the end of the Mongol yoke. Moscow was now fully independent, and Ivan began to style himself as the sovereign ruler of all Rus lands. He adopted the title of Gosudar, or sovereign, and increasingly used the title Tsar, derived from Caesar, though this title was not officially adopted until later. Ivan's court became more elaborate. He married Sophia Paleolog, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, after Byzantium had fallen to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. This marriage allowed Moscow to claim some of the prestige of Byzantium, and the idea began to develop that Moscow was the Third Rome, the successor to Rome and Constantinople as the centre of true Christianity. The double-headed eagle, the symbol of Byzantium, was adopted as the symbol of Moscow. Court ceremonies became more formal and elaborate, imitating Byzantine practices. Italian architects were brought to Moscow to rebuild the Kremlin, the fortified centre of the city, in a more impressive style. When Ivan died in 1505, he left behind a state that was large, powerful, and increasingly centralized. His son, Vasily III, continued his father's policies, completing the absorption of the remaining independent Rus principalities. But it would be Ivan's grandson, Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, who would take the process of state building to new and often terrifying extremes. Ivan the Terrible, Glory and Terror. Ivan IV became Grand Prince in 1533 at the age of 3. His early years were marked by regency rule, court intrigues, and a power struggle between noble families. Growing up in this atmosphere of intrigue and violence left a lasting mark on the young Ivan. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan had himself crowned not as Grand Prince, but as Tsar of all Russia. This was a significant symbolic step, elevating Moscow's ruler to a status equal to that of emperors. The coronation ceremony was elaborate, drawing on both Byzantine and Mongol traditions. The early years of Ivan's personal rule, from about 1547 to 1560, are often called the period of good government. Ivan worked with a group of advisors known as the Chosen Council. Together, they implemented various reforms. A new law code, the Sudebnik of 1550, was promulgated. The army was reorganized, creating new units of streltsy or musketeers armed with firearms. Local government was reformed, reducing the power of provincial governors. Church councils were held to regulate religious life. Externally, Ivan launched ambitious campaigns of expansion. To the east, he turned his attention to the remnants of the Mongol power. In 1552, Russian forces captured the city of Kazan, overthrowing the Kazan Khanate after a long siege. This was a major achievement, opening up the Middle Volga region to Russian expansion. 4 years later, in 1556, the Astrakhan Khanate on the lower Volga was also conquered. The entire Volga River was now under Russian control, and the way was open for expansion into the vast territories of Siberia. To the west, Ivan launched what would become known as the Livonian War in 1558, seeking to gain access to the Baltic Sea and the trade routes there. Initially, Russian forces made significant gains against the Livonian Order, but the war dragged on for decades and eventually drew in Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark. It would become a costly quagmire. But it was in the 1560s that Ivan's reign took a dark turn. In 1560, several events shook Ivan. His beloved wife, Anastasia, died, possibly poisoned, Ivan believed. He began to suspect that boyars, the old nobility, were plotting against him. His personality, always volatile, became increasingly paranoid and violent. In late 1564, Ivan suddenly left Moscow with a select group of loyal followers and much of the royal treasure. He went to the fortified settlement of Alexandrova Sloboda, about 60 miles northeast. From there, he sent messages to Moscow. He accused the boyars and church leaders of treason and announced his abdication. This created panic in Moscow. Delegations were sent to plead with Ivan to return. Eventually, Ivan agreed, but on his own terms. He divided Russia into 2 parts. One part, called the Zemshchina, would be ruled nominally by a figurehead. The other part, called the Opritnina, would be under Ivan's direct personal control, with its own administration, its own army, and its own territory scattered throughout Russia. The Opritnina, which lasted from 1565 to 1572 was a reign of terror. Ivan created a personal force of about 6,000 oprichniki, who wore black and whose symbol was a dog's head and a broom, signifying their role in sniffing out and sweeping away treason. These oprichniki were given estates confiscated from disgraced boyars and had virtually unlimited power over the population in their territories. The Oprichnina period saw mass arrests, executions, confiscations, and violence on a scale not seen before in Russian history. Entire families of suspected traitors were killed, towns suspected of disloyalty were attacked. In 1570, Ivan led an Oprichnina force against the city of Novgorod, which he suspected of planning to defect to Poland-Lithuania. The sack of Novgorod lasted for 5 weeks. Thousands were killed, thrown into the freezing Volkhov River, or tortured to death in elaborate ways. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Metropolitan Philip, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, spoke out against the Oprichnina's atrocities and was arrested, deposed, and eventually murdered. No one was safe from Ivan's suspicion, not even those closest to him. In 1581, in a fit of rage, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, also named Ivan, with his staff. The blow, whether intentional or accidental, killed the prince. The famous painting by Ilya Repin, created centuries later, captures the horror of this moment. Ivan cradling his dying son, his face a mask of anguish and madness. With his eldest son dead, Ivan's succession was in doubt. The last years of Ivan's reign were marked by exhaustion and failure. The Livonian War was finally ended in 1582 and 1583 with truces that gave Russia little. The Oprichnina had disrupted the economy and society. The population of many regions had declined through flight, famine, and violence. Ivan died in 1584, leaving the throne to his second son, Fyodor, a pious but mentally limited man who was incapable of ruling effectively. Real power fell into the hands of Fyodor's brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. Ivan the Terrible's reign was a crucial turning point in Russian history. He had greatly expanded Russia's territory, particularly to the east, laying the groundwork for the future Russian Empire. He had centralized power in the hands of the Tsar to an unprecedented degree, establishing patterns of autocratic rule that would last for centuries. But he had also traumatized Russian society, decimated the old nobility, and left behind a legacy of violence and terror. The Time of Troubles. Fyodor I ruled from 1584 to 1598, but he was a figurehead. Boris Godunov, his brother-in-law, was the real power behind the throne. Boris was an intelligent and capable administrator who tried to repair some of the damage from Ivan's reign. He promoted trade, corresponded with foreign powers, and maintained stability. But a question hung over the succession. Fyodor and his wife had no surviving children. Ivan the Terrible's third son, Dmitry, who might have inherited after Fyodor, had died in 1591 at the age of 8. The official explanation was that Dmitry had accidentally stabbed himself while having an epileptic seizure, but many suspected that Boris Godunov had arranged the boy's murder to clear his own path to the throne. When Fyodor died in 1598, the direct male line of the Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Rus for over 700 years, came to an end. After some manoeuvring, Boris Godunov was elected Tsar by an assembly of nobles and clergy, the Zemsky Sobor. Boris's reign began reasonably well, but it was soon beset by disasters. From 1601 to 1603, Russia experienced terrible harvests and famine. Hundreds of thousands died. The economy collapsed. Social unrest grew. Boris tried to provide relief, opening royal granaries and attempting to distribute food, but the crisis was too severe. Then, in 1604, a man appeared in Poland claiming to be Dmitry, Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, supposedly murdered in 1591. This man, known to history as False Dmitry I, claimed that he had miraculously survived the assassination attempt and had been living in hiding. He gathered support from Polish nobles and disaffected Russians and marched on Moscow. Boris Godunov died suddenly in April 1605, possibly from a stroke, possibly poisoned. His 16-year-old son, Fyodor, was briefly proclaimed Tsar, but the Godunov dynasty had little support. When false Dmitry's forces approached Moscow, the boyars switched sides. Fyodor Godunov and his mother were murdered, and false Dmitry entered Moscow in triumph in June 1605. False Dmitry's reign lasted less than a year. He alienated many Russians by his pro-Polish policies and his foreign mannerisms. Many suspected he was an impostor. In May 1606, a boyar conspiracy led by Vasily Shwisky overthrew and murdered false Dmitry. His body was burned, the ashes supposedly fired from a cannon toward Poland, from which he had come. Vasily Shwisky had himself proclaimed Tsar, but his hold on power was weak. Soon, another pretender appeared, known as False Dmitry II. He gathered an army and besieged Moscow from 1608 to 1610, setting up a rival court at the village of Tushino. Russia effectively had two Tsars, two governments, and was descending into chaos. Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden took advantage of the confusion to intervene militarily. Polish forces occupied Moscow in 1610 after Shwisky was deposed. The Swedish occupied Novgorod. False Dmitry II was murdered by one of his own followers in 1610. This period, from 1605 to 1613, is known as the Time of Troubles, or Smuta. It was a profound crisis that nearly destroyed Russia. The state apparatus had collapsed, foreign armies occupied major cities, multiple factions fought for control, and there was no clear legitimate authority. But from this chaos, a movement for national liberation emerged. The Russian Orthodox Church, particularly Patriarch Hermogenes, called for resistance against the foreign occupiers. Two popular militias were organized. The second, led by a merchant named Kuzma Minin and a prince named Dmitry Pozharsky, marched on Moscow in 1612 and, after hard fighting, forced the Polish garrison to surrender. With Moscow liberated, the question was who should be Tsar. In early 1613, a Zemsky Sobor representing various parts of Russian society was convened. After much deliberation, they elected as Tsar the 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov, a grandnephew of Ivan the Terrible's first wife, Anastasia. The choice was partly because Mikhail's connection to the old dynasty gave him some legitimacy, and partly because various factions hoped the young and inexperienced Mikhail could be controlled. Mikhail Romanov's coronation in July 1613 marks the end of the time of troubles and the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia until 1917, over 300 years. The early Romanovs, recovery and expansion. The early decades of Romanov rule were focused on recovery from the devastation of the time of troubles. Mikhail Romanov ruled from 1613 to 1645. He was assisted by his father, Patriarch Filaret, who had been held captive in Poland and returned to Russia in 1619. Filaret effectively co-ruled with his son, providing experience and authority. The new government had to rebuild state institutions, restore the economy, and negotiate peace with foreign powers. Treaties were signed with Sweden in 1617 and with Poland-Lithuania in 1618, though Russia had to cede significant territories, including Smolensk to Poland and parts of the Baltic coast to Sweden. Domestically, the government worked to restore order. The system of serfdom, which had been developing for decades, was strengthened as a way to stabilize the agricultural economy and ensure tax revenue and military service. Serfs, peasants, bound to the land and to their landlords, would become an increasingly important and controversial feature of Russian society. The Russian Orthodox Church continued to play a central role in legitimizing the new dynasty and providing moral authority. Monastery foundations were endowed, churches were rebuilt, and religious literature was promoted. Russia's expansion continued, particularly to the east into Siberia. Russian fur trappers, traders, and adventurers, known as Promyshleniki and Cossacks, pushed eastward in search of valuable furs, particularly sable. They moved along the great Siberian rivers, establishing fortified outposts. By the 1640s, Russian explorers had reached the Pacific Ocean. This expansion created a vast new territory for Russia, though it was thinly populated and difficult to control. Mikhail's son, Alexei, became Tsar in 1645 at the age of 16. Alexei Mikhailovich, known as Alexei the Tranquil for his gentle personality, ruled until 1676. His reign saw significant events both at home and abroad. In 1648, a series of urban uprisings broke out in Moscow and other cities, sparked by high taxes and corrupt officials. The Salt Riot in Moscow was particularly serious, with crowds attacking government buildings and killing unpopular officials. Alexei was forced to promise reforms and to convene a Zemsky Sobor to address grievances. The Sobor of 1649 produced a new law code, the Ulogeny, which remained the basis of Russian law until the 19th century. Notably, the Ulogeny finalized the legal status of serfs, making serfdom hereditary and removing time limits on the recovery of fugitive serfs. This effectively completed the encirclement of the Russian peasantry. In the 1650s, a religious controversy erupted that would have long-lasting consequences. Patriarch Nikon, a strong-willed church leader appointed in 1652, initiated reforms to correct what he saw as errors and inconsistencies in Russian Orthodox practices. He wanted to align Russian practices more closely with Greek Orthodox traditions. The reforms included changes to the liturgy, the way of making the sign of the cross, and the spelling of Jesus' name. These may seem like minor issues, but to many devout Russians, these traditions were sacred. A significant portion of the clergy and the faithful rejected the reforms, seeing them as heresy. These opponents became known as Old Believers. Despite official persecution, including imprisonment and execution of leaders like the archpriest Avvakum, the Old Believers persisted. The schism, or raskol, split the Russian church and created a dissident religious community that would never fully reconcile with the official church. Alexei's reign also saw important territorial expansion. In the 1654, the Cossacks of Ukraine, who had been under Polish rule, rebelled and sought Russian protection. Their leader, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, signed the Pereyaslav Agreement with Russia, which led to a long war with Poland-Lithuania from 1654 to 1667. The war ended with the Treaty of Andrusovo, which gave Russia control of left bank Ukraine and Kiev, major territorial gains that brought millions of new subjects and shifted the balance of power in Eastern Europe. In the south and east, Russia continued to expand and consolidate its control, building new forts and bringing more territory under central administration. But this expansion also led to conflicts, particularly with nomadic peoples and with the emerging threat of the Ottoman Empire and its vassal, the Crimean Khanate. When Alexei died in 1676, he left behind a larger and more powerful state than he had inherited. But he also left behind complex succession issues that would lead to more instability. Peter the Great, Transformation and Modernization. Alexei had multiple children from 2 marriages. His first wife gave him several children, including Fyodor and Ivan. His second wife, Natalia Narishkina, gave him Peter. When Alexei died, his eldest surviving son, the sickly Fyodor III, became Tsar. Fyodor died in 1682 without children, and a succession crisis erupted. The choice was between Ivan, who was 15 but mentally and physically disabled, and Peter, who was only 10 but healthy and bright. After much conflict, including a violent uprising by the Streltsy, the military units that supported Ivan's family, a compromise was reached. Both Ivan and Peter would be co-tsars, with Ivan's sister Sophia serving as regent. Sophia ruled competently from 1682 to 1689, but as Peter grew older, tensions increased. In 1689, when Peter was 17, he moved to seize power. Sophia's support crumbled, and she was forced into a convent. Peter became the effective sole ruler, though Ivan remained nominally co-tsar until his death in 1696. Peter I, known to history as Peter the Great, ruled Russia from 1689 to 1725. He was one of the most consequential rulers in Russian history, transforming Russia from a relatively isolated and traditional society into a major European power with a modernized military, administration, and culture. Peter was an extraordinary individual, towering physically, at about 6 feet 8 inches tall, in an age when the average height was much shorter. He was intensely curious, energetic, and willing to break with tradition in ways that shocked his conservative subjects. He was also brutal and ruthless when he felt it necessary. Early in his reign, Peter became fascinated with Western technology and culture. In 1697 to 1698, he undertook an unprecedented step for a Russian Tsar. He travelled incognito to Western Europe as part of what was called the Grand Embassy. Peter visited Holland, England, and other countries, learning about shipbuilding, military technology, administration, and culture. He worked as a carpenter in Dutch shipyards, visited factories and arsenals, met with scientists and craftsmen, and generally absorbed everything he could about how Western European societies functioned. Peter returned to Russia determined to modernize his country. The transformation he initiated touched nearly every aspect of Russian life. He reformed the military along Western lines, creating a modern standing army with regular training and discipline, and built a powerful navy from almost nothing. He reformed the administration, creating new government colleges or departments modelled on Swedish examples. He simplified the alphabet and promoted education and technical learning. He founded Russia's first newspaper. He even reformed personal behaviour, famously forcing nobles to shave their traditional beards and wear Western-style clothing. Many of these reforms were deeply resented by traditional Russians, who saw them as unorthodox and un-Russian. But Peter pushed forward ruthlessly, punishing those who resisted and rewarding those who embraced change. Peter's greatest ambition was to secure for Russia a window to the west, a warm water port that would allow Russia to trade and communicate more easily with Western Europe. The Baltic Sea was controlled by Sweden, then a major power. In 1700, Peter joined with Denmark and Poland-Lithuania in a war against Sweden, beginning what became known as the Great Northern War. The war started disastrously for Russia. In November 1700, at the Battle of Narva, a much smaller Swedish force under the young King Charles XII utterly defeated Peter's army. But Peter learned from this defeat. He rebuilt his army and persisted. Charles XII chose to campaign in Poland and then Ukraine rather than following up his victory, giving Peter time to recover. The decisive battle came in 1709 at Poltava in Ukraine. Charles XII, allied with a Ukrainian Cossack leader, Ivan Mazepa, who had defected from Russia, confronted Peter's army. The Battle of Poltava was a crushing Russian victory. The Swedish army was destroyed. Charles fled to Ottoman territory, and Sweden would never recover its status as a great power. The Great Northern War continued until 1721, but after Poltava, the outcome was not in doubt. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721 gave Russia control of the eastern Baltic coast, including Estonia, Livonia, and part of Finland. Peter had his window to the west, but Peter had not waited for the war to end to make use of his conquests. In 1703, even while the war was still raging, Peter had founded a new city at the mouth of the Neva River, on land recently captured from Sweden. This city, named St. Petersburg, would become Peter's greatest monument. St. Petersburg was built under the most difficult conditions. The site was swampy, unhealthy, and exposed to Swedish attack. Thousands of workers died during the construction, from disease, accidents, and the harsh conditions. But Peter was determined. He brought in Western architects, laid out a modern city with straight streets and canals like Amsterdam, built grand palaces and government buildings, and in 1712 he moved the capital of Russia from Moscow to St. Petersburg. This was a symbolic break with old Russia, a statement that Russia was now a European power looking westward. In 1721, after the Treaty of Nystad, Peter took the title of Emperor and declared Russia an empire. The Russian Empire was officially born, and it would last until 1917. Peter's transformation of Russia was not limited to government and military. He reformed the nobility, creating a table of ranks in 1722 that made advancement based on merit and service rather than birth alone. He secularized church properties and subordinated the church to state control, abolishing the office of patriarch and replacing it with a holy synod that he controlled. He promoted industry and commerce, founding factories and encouraging trade. But Peter's reign also had its dark side. The cost of his reforms and wars was enormous. Taxes increased dramatically, and the burden fell most heavily on the peasantry. Forced labour was used for major projects, including building St. Petersburg. Political opposition was crushed mercilessly. Peter even had his own son, Alexei, who had opposed his father's reforms, arrested and tortured. Alexei died in prison in 1718, probably from the effects of torture, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. When Peter died in 1725, having failed to clearly designate a successor, he left behind a transformed Russia. It was a major European power, with a modern army and navy, a new capital, a more centralized administration, and an elite class that looked to Western Europe for models. But it was also a country with deep tensions between the westernized elite and the traditional masses, between the demands of the state and the capacity of the population, tensions that would shape Russian history for the next 2 centuries. The era of palace revolutions. Peter's death in 1725 ushered in a period of instability known as the era of palace revolutions. For much of the 18th century, Russia's throne changed hands frequently, often through coups organized by the Guards regiments, the elite military units based in St. Petersburg. Peter had not designated a clear successor. His second wife, Catherine, a woman of humble Lithuanian origin whom Peter had married after having a church ceremony in 1712, seized power with the support of the Guards. She ruled as Catherine I from 1725 to 1727, largely leaving actual governance to Peter's close associates. After her death, the throne passed to Peter's grandson, Peter II, who died of smallpox in 1730 at the age of 14. The throne then went to Anna, daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother, Ivan V. Anna Ivanovna ruled from 1730 to 1740. Her reign is often remembered for the influence of foreign advisors, particularly Germans, and for political repression. The secret police, the Chancery for Secret Investigative Affairs, was particularly active, and many nobles were exiled to Siberia on suspicion of disloyalty. After Anna died, there was another brief succession crisis, with a baby, Ivan VI, proclaimed emperor. But within a year, in 1741, Peter the Great's daughter Elizabeth overthrew the infant emperor in a coup and took the throne. Elizabeth Petrovna ruled from 1741 to 1762. Her reign was more stable and is often seen as a cultural golden age. Elizabeth loved luxury, art, and entertainment. She built magnificent palaces, including the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, designed by the Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli in the ornate Baroque style. She patronized the arts and sciences, founding Russia's first university in Moscow in 1755. Under Elizabeth, Russia became more firmly established as a European power. Russia participated in the War of the Austrian Succession and then in the 7 Years' War, fighting successfully against Prussia. Russian armies even briefly occupied Berlin in 1760. This demonstrated Russia's military strength, but also its ability to project power deep into Central Europe. Elizabeth never married and had no legitimate children. She designated her nephew, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, as her heir. This young man, who became Peter III, was the grandson of Peter the Great through his mother. He had been raised in Germany and barely spoke Russian, and he admired Prussia and its king, Frederick II, greatly. Peter III's brief reign in 1762 was a disaster. He immediately made peace with Prussia, throwing away all the gains Russia had made in the 7 Years' War, and he alienated the guards and the church with various ill-considered policies. After only 6 months, his wife, a German princess who had converted to Orthodoxy and taken the name Catherine, organized a coup. The guards supported her, Peter was deposed, and he died shortly afterward in custody, probably murdered. Catherine II, known as Catherine the Great, would rule Russia for the next 34 years, from 1762 to 1796, presiding over what many consider the high point of the Russian Empire. Catherine the Great, Enlightenment and Expansion. Catherine was born Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German principality. She had been brought to Russia as a teenager to marry the heir to the throne. She was intelligent, well-educated, and ambitious. After seizing power, she proved to be one of the most capable rulers in Russian history. Catherine styled herself as an enlightened monarch. She corresponded with Voltaire and other French philosophies, read widely in political philosophy, and even wrote a grand instruction in 1767, a document outlining her vision for legal reform and good government, heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu and Beccaria. She convened a legislative commission in 1767 to reform Russia's laws, bringing together representatives from various estates and regions. However, the commission proved unwieldy and was dissolved in 1768 without achieving major reforms. In practice, Catherine's enlightened ideals had limits. She did undertake some reforms in education, administration, and culture. She promoted education, founding schools and institutions. She reorganized provincial administration with the provincial reform of 1775, creating a more systematic structure. She supported the arts and sciences, accumulating a magnificent art collection that became the foundation of the Hermitage Museum. But on the fundamental question of serfdom, Catherine did nothing to improve the condition of the peasants, and in fact strengthened the institution. The nobility's power over their serfs increased during her reign. A massive peasant rebellion from 1773 to 1775, led by a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev, who claimed to be the murdered Peter III, terrified the nobility and the government. The rebellion was eventually crushed, and Pugachev was executed, but it demonstrated the deep social tensions in Russian society. Catherine's reign saw major territorial expansion. Russia participated in 3 partitions of Poland-Lithuania in 1772, 1793, and 1795, along with Prussia and Austria. By the end, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent state, divided among its neighbours. Russia gained vast territories in what is now Belarus and Ukraine, bringing millions of new subjects, many of them Catholics and Jews, into the empire. In the south, Catherine waged 2 successful wars against the Ottoman Empire. The Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 resulted in the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, which gave Russia control of the northern Black Sea coast and the right to intervene on behalf of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The Second War, from 1787 to 1792, led to the annexation of Crimea in 1783 and further gains. Catherine's most famous general, Grigory Potemkin, who was also her lover and close advisor, played a key role in the conquest and colonization of the south. He founded new cities, including Sevastopol, and organized the settlement of the newly acquired territories. There's a famous story, probably apocryphal, about Potemkin erecting fake village facades, Potemkin villages, to impress Catherine during her tour of the south in 1787. While the story is likely false, it has become a metaphor for deceptive show. By the end of Catherine's reign, Russia was one of the great powers of Europe. Its territory stretched from Poland to Alaska, which Russia had colonized in the late 18th century. Its army was large and battle-tested. Its court was magnificent. St. Petersburg had become one of the great capitals of Europe, with grand palaces, a thriving cultural life, and an aristocracy that spoke French and imitated Western manners. But beneath the glittering surface, Russia remained a deeply unequal society. The nobility, particularly the great magnates, enjoyed enormous wealth and privilege. Western European luxuries, books, and ideas circulated freely among the elite. But the vast majority of the population, the serfs, remained trapped in a system that amounted to slavery in all but name. They could be bought, sold, separated from their families, punished at their master's whim, and had essentially no legal rights. This contradiction between the westernized, cultured elite and the enserfed masses would define Russia's development in the 19th century and ultimately contribute to the revolutionary upheavals of the 20th. Catherine died in 1796 and was succeeded by her son Paul, whose brief and erratic reign lasted until 1801, when he was murdered in a palace coup the last of the 18th century palace revolutions. Paul's son Alexander I then took the throne, ruling at the beginning of what would be a tumultuous 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars and Alexander I. Alexander I ruled from 1801 to 1825. He began his reign with liberal intentions, influenced by Enlightenment ideas. He surrounded himself with young reformers and discussed constitutional government, the emancipation of the serfs, and educational improvements. Some reforms were implemented. The administration was reorganized, new universities were founded, and censorship was relaxed. But the great event of Alexander's reign was the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to power in France, crowned himself emperor in 1804, and was conquering much of Europe. Russia initially tried to maintain a balance, but in 1805, Alexander joined the Third Coalition against France. Russian forces fought at Austerlitz in 1805, suffering a crushing defeat against Napoleon. They fought again at Eylau in 1807, a costly draw, and at Friedland, another French victory. Alexander was forced to make peace. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 established a shaky alliance between Russia and France. Alexander agreed to join Napoleon's continental system, an economic blockade against Britain. But this alliance was unpopular in Russia and harmful to the economy. Relations deteriorated, and in June 1812, Napoleon launched the largest invasion in history up to that time, crossing into Russia with an army of over 600,000 men from all across his empire. The Russian strategy was to retreat, avoiding a decisive battle while stretching Napoleon's supply lines. Russian commander Mikhail Kutuzov, an old and experienced general, reluctantly gave battle at Borodino in September 1812, about 70 miles west of Moscow. The Battle of Borodino was one of the bloodiest single days of combat in the Napoleonic Wars. Both sides suffered horrendous casualties, with over 70,000 killed or wounded. Neither side could claim complete victory, but Kutuzov retreated, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon entered Moscow in mid-September 1812, expecting Alexander to surrender, but Alexander refused to negotiate. Moscow, largely wooden, was devastated by fires, probably started by Russians to deny the French shelter and supplies. Napoleon found himself in a ruined city with winter approaching and no prospect of peace. After waiting for over a month, Napoleon finally ordered a retreat in mid-October. The retreat from Moscow became a catastrophe. Winter came early and harsh. Russian forces and partisans harried the retreating French. Supply shortages, cold, disease, and constant attacks reduced the Grand Army to a fraction of its size. Of the 600,000 men who had invaded, perhaps only a few tens of thousands made it back across the Russian border alive and in fighting condition. Russia's survival and the destruction of Napoleon's army transformed the European political landscape. Alexander pursued the war into Europe, leading the coalition forces that eventually defeated Napoleon. Russian troops entered Paris in 1814. At the Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815, Alexander played a major role in reshaping post-Napoleonic Europe. Russia gained Poland, organized as a semi-autonomous kingdom with Alexander as king. Alexander's international prestige was at its height. He was seen as the savior of Europe from Napoleonic tyranny. He promoted the Holy Alliance, a vague commitment by Christian monarchs to rule according to Christian principles. But domestically, Alexander's reign became increasingly conservative and repressive after 1812. The liberal projects of his early years were abandoned. The reformer Mikhail Speransky was dismissed and exiled. Military colonies, an attempt to make soldiers support themselves through farming, were established and proved deeply unpopular. Censorship increased. Mystical and religious influences grew around Alexander, who became more withdrawn and melancholic. When Alexander died suddenly in 1825 in the southern town of Taganrog, rumours immediately spread that he had not really died but had gone into hiding to live as a hermit. These rumours persisted for years and reflected the mysterious and enigmatic nature of Alexander's personality. Alexander's death led to a succession crisis. He had no children. His younger brother Constantine was next in line, but had secretly renounced his claim. The next brother, Nicholas, was supposed to succeed, but did not know this initially. In the confusion, a group of liberal army officers, influenced by Western ideas and frustrated by Russia's autocracy, attempted a coup on December 14th, 1825. They gathered troops in Senate Square in St. Petersburg, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas and demanding a constitution. This December 14th revolt, and the participants known as Decembrists, was quickly suppressed by loyalist troops. Nicholas ordered artillery to fire on the rebels, and the revolt collapsed. The Decembrists were arrested, tried, and punished. 5 leaders were hanged, and over 100 were exiled to Siberia. The Decembrist revolt was a failure, but it became a symbol for later generations of Russian revolutionaries, remembered as a noble, if doomed, attempt to bring liberal reform to Russia. Nicholas I, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Nicholas I ruled from 1825 to 1855. His reign was marked by conservatism, repression, and an attempt to freeze Russia's social and political development to prevent revolution. The Decembrist revolt at the very beginning of his reign profoundly affected Nicholas. He saw himself as defending Russia from dangerous Western ideas like constitutionalism and democracy. His ideology was summed up in the slogan orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, promoted by his Minister of Education, Sergei Uvarov. Russia's strength, in this view, came from its orthodox faith, its autocratic political system, and its unique national character, not from imitating the West. Nicholas strengthened the secret police, creating the third section of the imperial chancery, which monitored dissent, censored publications, and arrested suspicious individuals. Censorship became strict. Universities were watched for signs of liberal or radical thought. Foreign travel was restricted, and foreign books were carefully controlled. Nicholas also attempted to codify Russia's laws, a project that had been discussed since Catherine the Great's time. Mikhail Speransky, recalled from exile, led this effort, and the complete collection of laws of the Russian Empire was published in multiple volumes, organizing centuries of Tsarist decrees. In foreign policy, Nicholas saw Russia as the defender of conservatism and monarchy against revolution. When revolutions broke out across Europe in 1830 and again in 1848, Nicholas offered to help suppress them. In 1849, Russian troops helped the Austrian Empire crush the Hungarian Revolution, earning Nicholas the nickname the Gendarme of Europe. But Nicholas's reign also saw Russia enter a disastrous war that exposed its weaknesses. In 1853, conflict over the rights of Christian sites in the Ottoman Empire and Russia's role as protector of Orthodox Christians led to the Crimean War. Britain and France, concerned about Russian expansion toward the Mediterranean, joined the Ottoman Empire against Russia. The war went badly for Russia from the start. Despite fighting on its own territory, Russia struggled. The siege of Sevastopol in Crimea lasted nearly a year, from October 1854 to September 1855. Russian forces fought bravely, but they were hampered by poor logistics, outdated weapons, and incompetent command. British and French forces, though they had to transport everything by sea, had superior rifles, steamships, and railways. Russia's army still relied largely on smoothbore muskets and sailing ships. Nicholas died in March 1855, possibly by suicide, disillusioned and depressed by Russia's failures. The war continued under his son Alexander II, ending in 1856 with the Treaty of Paris, a humiliation for Russia that restricted its naval presence in the Black Sea and demonstrated that Russia had fallen behind the Western powers militarily and economically. The Crimean War was a wake-up call. It made clear that Russia's social system, particularly serfdom, was a fundamental weakness. Serfs made poor soldiers compared to the more motivated troops of Britain and France. The empire's economy, based on serf labour, was stagnant and unable to support a modern military. Reform could no longer be postponed. Alexander II and the Great Reforms. Alexander II, who ruled from 1855 to 1881, came to be known as the Tsar Liberator because of the sweeping reforms he implemented, most importantly the emancipation of the serfs. Alexander understood that change was necessary. He famously said, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until it abolishes itself from below," recognizing that peasant rebellion was a real possibility if reform did not come. The emancipation of the serfs was announced on February 19th, 1861. After centuries of bondage, the roughly 23 million private serfs, there were also state peasants with somewhat different status, were declared free persons with legal rights. However, the emancipation was complex and in many ways unsatisfying. The peasants did not simply receive their freedom and land. Instead, land was transferred to peasant communes, the mir or obshchina, which then redistributed it periodically among families. Peasants had to make redemption payments to the government over 49 years to compensate the former landlords. These payments were burdensome and kept many peasants in poverty. Former landlords retained significant amounts of land, often the best land, while peasants received less than they had worked before emancipation. Moreover, peasants were not free to leave their communes without permission. The commune was collectively responsible for tax payments and redemption payments, which meant it had authority to prevent individuals from leaving. So while serfdom was officially ended, many peasants found their circumstances improved only marginally. Nevertheless, emancipation was a massive historical step, transforming Russia's social structure and setting in motion economic and social changes that would continue for decades. Alexander did not stop with emancipation. He implemented a series of other reforms in the 1860s. Local government reform in 1864 created elected zemstvos, assemblies at the district and provincial level that dealt with local issues like education, healthcare, and roads. This gave educated Russians, including some peasants, a chance to participate in governance, though the zemstvos' powers were limited. Judicial reform in 1864 modernized Russia's legal system, introducing jury trials, public court proceedings, an independent judiciary, and justices of the peace. This was perhaps the most successful of Alexander's reforms, creating a legal system more similar to those of Western Europe. Military reform in the 1860s and 1870s, led by War Minister Dmitry Miliutin, modernized the army. Universal military service was introduced in 1874, ending the old system where serfs provided the bulk of long-term conscripts, while nobles often avoided service. The new system required all men, regardless of class, to serve. Though the length of service varied, the military became more professional, better equipped, and better trained. Education was expanded, with universities gaining more autonomy and censorship being relaxed, at least initially. Primary schools increased in number, and literacy slowly began to rise, though Russia still lagged far behind Western Europe in this regard. These great reforms, as they came to be known, represented the most significant modernization effort in Russia since Peter the Great. They transformed Russia's legal, administrative, and social structures, but they also created new tensions. The reforms raised expectations for further change. Many educated Russians believed the reforms did not go far enough and wanted a constitution, representative government, and more radical social change. Others, particularly among the nobility and conservative elements, thought the reforms went too far and undermined Russia's traditional order. A revolutionary movement began to develop in the 1860s and 1870s. Young, educated Russians, influenced by radical Western ideas and frustrated with the pace and limits of reform, began to organize. Some were nihilists who rejected traditional values and authority. Others were populists who idealized the peasantry and believed that Russia could skip capitalism and move directly to a socialist society based on the peasant commune. In the early 1870s, thousands of young radicals participated in what was called going to the people, travelling to the countryside to educate and radicalize peasants. But the peasants were generally suspicious or uninterested, and many of the young radicals were arrested. As peaceful propaganda seemed futile, some revolutionaries turned to terrorism. The organization People's Will, or Narodnaya Volya, made it their mission to assassinate Alexander II, believing that killing the Tsar would spark a revolution. They made multiple attempts on his life, bombing his train, bombing the Winter Palace while he was there, and finally, on March 13th, 1881, successfully assassinating him with a bomb thrown at his carriage in St. Petersburg. The assassination occurred just as Alexander was reportedly considering further reforms, possibly including some form of representative assembly. His death ended that possibility and ushered in a period of reaction. Alexander III and the era of reaction. Alexander III, who ruled from 1881 to 1894, responded to his father's assassination by implementing conservative policies aimed at preventing further revolutionary activity. He was strongly influenced by his former tutor, Konstantin Pobedonostsev, a conservative thinker who believed in autocracy, Orthodox Christianity, and Russian nationalism. The reforms of Alexander II were not entirely reversed, but their liberal elements were curtailed. The independence of the judiciary was undermined. Universities lost much of their autonomy and were subjected to increased surveillance. Censorship was tightened. The secret police, the Okhrana, was strengthened and became highly effective at infiltrating revolutionary groups. Politically unreliable individuals were exiled to Siberia or forced abroad. The revolutionaries who had killed Alexander II were hunted down and executed. The revolutionary movement was driven underground or into foreign exile. Alexander III also pursued policies of Russification, attempting to impose Russian language and culture on the empire's many ethnic minorities. This was particularly harsh in Poland, Finland, and the Baltic provinces, where local languages were suppressed in schools and administration. These policies bred resentment and strengthened nationalist movements among non-Russian peoples. Anti-Jewish policies intensified during this period. Jews in the Russian Empire, numbering several million and concentrated in the Pale of Settlement, a western region where they were required to live, faced legal restrictions on where they could live, what professions they could enter, and what schools they could attend. Pogroms, violent attacks on Jewish communities, occurred with increasing frequency in the 1880s and 1890s, often with the tacit approval or even encouragement of local authorities. These persecutions led hundreds of thousands of Jews to emigrate, many to the United States. Despite the political repression, Russia experienced significant economic development during Alexander III's reign. Industrialization accelerated. Railways expanded dramatically, including the beginning of construction on the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1891, which would eventually stretch over 5,000 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok. Heavy industry, particularly coal, iron, and steel production, grew. Foreign investment flowed in, especially from France. This industrial growth, however, created new social problems. A growing industrial working class lived in poor conditions in the cities, working long hours in dangerous factories for low wages. These workers would eventually become a powerful revolutionary force. Alexander III's reign was relatively peaceful internationally, earning him the title of the peacemaker. Russia avoided major wars and focused on internal development and expansion in Central Asia, where Russia completed the conquest of territories that would become Turkestan, bringing millions of Muslim subjects into the empire. Alexander died unexpectedly in 1894 at the age of 49 from kidney disease. His son Nicholas, who was only 26 and unprepared for rule, became the last Tsar of Russia. Nicholas II, the last Tsar. Nicholas II ruled from 1894 until his abdication in 1917. His reign would witness war, revolution, and ultimately the end of the Romanov dynasty and the Russian Empire. Nicholas was a personally pleasant man, devoted to his family, but he was weak-willed, poorly educated in statecraft, and firmly committed to autocracy as a sacred trust from God. He once remarked that he considered representative government a senseless dream. This rigidity, in an age of rapid social change and mounting pressures for reform, would prove disastrous. Nicholas's reign began tragically. At his coronation celebration in 1896, a stampede at Kudinka Field in Moscow killed over 1,000 people who were there to receive commemorative gifts. Nicholas was persuaded to continue with the planned festivities that evening, attending a ball at the French ambassador's residence, which struck many as callous and set an ominous tone for the reign. Russia's industrial development continued rapidly in the 1890s under the guidance of Finance Minister Sergei Witte. The Trans-Siberian Railway neared completion. Industrial production soared, cities grew, but this growth brought social tensions. Workers began to organize and strike for better conditions. Revolutionary groups, including Marxist Social Democrats, who believed the industrial working class would be the agent of revolution, began to gain influence. In foreign policy, Russia pursued expansion in East Asia, seeking ice-free ports and influence in Manchuria and Korea. This brought Russia into conflict with Japan, which had its own imperial ambitions in the region. In February 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, beginning the Russo-Japanese War. The war was a disaster for Russia. The Japanese, underestimated by the Russians, proved to be formidable opponents. Port Arthur fell after a long siege in January 1905. The Russian army was defeated at Mukden in March 1905. Most dramatically, the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world to confront the Japanese, was annihilated at the Battle of Tsushima Strait in May 1905. It was a humiliating defeat, the first time a non-Western power had defeated a major European power in modern times. The war's humiliations, combined with economic hardship and political frustration, sparked revolution at home. On January 22, 1905, a peaceful demonstration of workers and their families approached the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to petition the Tsar for better working conditions and political reforms. The demonstration, led by a priest named Father Gapon, was fired upon by troops. Hundreds were killed or wounded in what became known as Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday shattered the traditional image of the Tsar as the benevolent father of his people. Strikes and protests erupted across Russia throughout 1905. Peasants seized land from nobles. Ethnic minorities rioted. In October 1905, a general strike paralyzed the country. Nicholas was forced to make concessions. On October 30th, he issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties, an elected parliament called the Duma, and that no law would be passed without the Duma's approval. This appeared to transform Russia into a constitutional monarchy. But Nicholas had no intention of truly sharing power. The fundamental laws issued in April 1906 reaffirmed the Tsar's autocratic power. The Duma's authority was limited. The Tsar retained control over the military, foreign policy, and much of the budget. He could dissolve the Duma at will and rule by decree when it was not in session. The first Duma, elected in 1906, was dominated by liberals and reformers who demanded real constitutional government. Nicholas dissolved it after just over 2 months. The Second Duma met in 1907 and was also dissolved after a few months. The electoral law was then changed to favour conservative and wealthy voters, ensuring that the Third and Fourth Duma from 1907 to 1917 were more compliant. The revolution of 1905 was suppressed through a combination of concessions and repression. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, who served from 1906 to 1911, implemented both reforms and harsh measures. His agrarian reforms aimed to create a class of prosperous peasant landowners by allowing peasants to leave the commune and consolidate their strips of land into private farms. But he also used military courts and executions to suppress dissent. The hangman's noose became known as Stolypin's necktie. By the early 1910s, Russia appeared to have stabilized. The economy was growing rapidly again. The revolutionary movement seemed to have been defeated, with many leaders in exile or prison. Some historians have argued that if Russia had avoided war, continued economic development might have led to gradual political evolution. But Russia did not avoid war. In the summer of 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary triggered a chain of events that led to World War I. Russia, bound by alliance to Serbia and France, mobilized its army. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st, 1914. Within weeks, most of Europe was at war. World War I and Revolution. Russia entered World War I with patriotic enthusiasm. Massive crowds in St. Petersburg sang the national anthem and cheered for the Tsar. The capital's name was changed from the German-sounding St. Petersburg to the more Russian Petrograd. Political parties declared a truce and supported the war effort. But Russia was not prepared for a modern industrial war. The initial campaigns of 1914 saw some successes against Austria-Hungary, but a disastrous defeat against Germany at Tannenberg in East Prussia, where an entire Russian army was destroyed. As the war dragged on, Russia's disadvantages became clear. The army suffered from shortages of rifles, ammunition, and shells. Transportation infrastructure could not adequately supply the front. Casualties mounted into the millions. By 1915, Russian forces were in retreat along much of the front. In September 1915, Nicholas made the fateful decision to take personal command of the army, moving to military headquarters. This meant that he would be blamed personally for military failures. It also left the government in Petrograd without his presence, increasingly under the influence of his wife, Alexandra, and her confidant, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian peasant and self-proclaimed holy man who had gained influence over Alexandra because he seemed able to help her hemophiliac son, Alexei, during his bleeding episodes. Rasputin's apparent ability to ease the boy's suffering, probably through hypnosis and calming Alexandra's anxiety, made him indispensable to the imperial family. But Rasputin was a controversial figure, rumoured to be debauched and manipulative, and his influence over government appointments and policies scandalised the elite. On the home front, the war caused enormous strain. Inflation soared. Food shortages developed as the agricultural system was disrupted by mobilization and transport priorities for the military. workers in cities faced hardship. By 1916, strikes were increasing. In December 1916, a group of nobles assassinated Rasputin, luring him to a palace, poisoning him, shooting him, and finally throwing his body into the Neva River. They hoped this would remove a malign influence and perhaps save the monarchy, but it was too late. By early 1917, the situation was desperate. Bread shortages in Petrograd led to long queues and frustration. On March 8, 1917, International Women's Day, women workers and others took to the streets demanding bread. The demonstrations grew over the following days. On March 11th, Nicholas ordered the troops to fire on the crowds, but many soldiers refused. Some units mutinied and joined the demonstrators. Within days, the authority of the government collapsed in Petrograd. The Duma formed a provisional committee and then a provisional government. Simultaneously, workers and soldiers formed a Soviet or council, reviving the model from 1905. Nicholas, at military headquarters, tried to return to Petrograd but was stopped. His generals and advisors urged him to abdicate to save the dynasty and the war effort. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas abdicated, first in favour of his son Alexei, then, when told Alexei's haemophilia was incurable, in favour of his brother Grand Duke Michael. Michael declined to accept the throne without the approval of a constituent assembly. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty had ended, the Russian Empire had ceased to exist, what would replace it was uncertain. The provisional government and dual power. The period from March to November 1917, often called the February Revolution by the old Russian calendar, was one of political chaos and social upheaval. Russia tried to function as a democracy while simultaneously fighting a major war and dealing with profound social tensions. The provisional government, led first by Prince Georgy Lvov and then, from July, by Alexander Kerensky, faced an impossible situation. It was committed to continuing the war, honouring Russia's alliances with Britain and France. But the war was deeply unpopular with war-weary soldiers and workers. The government wanted to postpone major social reforms until a constituent assembly could be elected and a permanent government established, but peasants were seizing land and workers were demanding change immediately. Moreover, the provisional government had to share power with the Petrograd Soviet, which represented workers and soldiers and had real authority on the ground, particularly over the military. This dual power arrangement was inherently unstable. Political parties across the spectrum organised and competed for support. The most important included the Constitutional Democrats, or Cadets, liberals who wanted parliamentary democracy, the Socialist Revolutionaries, populist socialists with strong peasant support, the Mensheviks, moderate Marxists who believed Russia needed a bourgeois democratic phase before socialism, and the Bolsheviks, radical Marxists led by Vladimir Lenin, who advocated immediate socialist revolution. Lenin had been in exile in Switzerland when the revolution occurred. The German government, hoping to knock Russia out of the war, arranged for Lenin and other revolutionaries to travel through Germany in a sealed train to Russia. Lenin arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd in April 1917 and immediately began calling for the Bolsheviks to seize power, issuing his April Theses, which called for all power to the Soviets and an end to the war. throughout the spring and summer of 1917, Russia's situation deteriorated. A military offensive in June, urged by the government to show its allies that Russia was still committed to the war, ended in disaster with mass desertions. In July, demonstrations known as the July Days nearly overthrew the government. The Bolsheviks were blamed, Lenin fled to Finland, and other leaders were arrested. But in August, a right-wing coup attempt by General Lav Kornilov failed when railway workers and soldiers refused to support him. Kerensky had to arm workers and release Bolshevik prisoners to defend Petrograd, inadvertently strengthening the left. By the fall, support for the Bolsheviks was growing rapidly, especially among soldiers and urban workers. The Bolshevik slogan, "Peace, Land and Bread," was simple and appealing. Elections to Soviets in major cities gave the Bolsheviks majorities. Lenin, from hiding, urged the Bolshevik leadership to seize power before the scheduled Constituent Assembly elections. On November 6th and 7th, Bolshevik Red Guards and sympathetic military units seized key points in Petrograd, bridges, railway stations, telephone exchanges, and government buildings. The Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, was taken on the night of November 7th after minimal resistance. Kerensky fled. The Bolsheviks claimed power. The Bolsheviks in power and the Civil War. The Bolshevik seizure of power, called the October Revolution by the old calendar, was relatively bloodless in Petrograd, but establishing control over all of Russia would take years of brutal civil war. The Bolsheviks immediately issued decrees reflecting their promises. The decree on peace called for an immediate end to the war. The decree on land sanctioned peasant seizures of noble estates. Banks were nationalized. Workers' control over factories was proclaimed. But the Bolsheviks faced enormous opposition. Other socialist parties denounced the coup. Nationalist movements in Ukraine, Finland, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Central Asia sought independence. Anti-Bolshevik forces began to organize. In December 1917, the long-promised elections to the Constituent Assembly took place. The Bolsheviks won only about 25% of the vote, while the Socialist Revolutionaries won a plurality. When the assembly convened in January 1918, the Bolsheviks allowed it to meet for one day before dissolving it by force, ending Russia's brief experiment with democratic socialism. Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, taking Russia out of World War I. The treaty was humiliating, giving up vast territories including Ukraine, the Baltic provinces, Poland, and Finland. But Lenin argued that Russia needed peace at any price to consolidate Bolshevik power. By the summer of 1918, Russia had descended into full-scale civil war. The Whites, a loose coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces including monarchists, liberals, moderate socialists, and nationalists, controlled large areas. The Bolshevik Reds controlled the central heartland. Foreign powers intervened, with Britain, France, the United States, and Japan sending troops to various parts of Russia, ostensibly to prevent war supplies from falling into German hands, but also to support the Whites and perhaps overthrow the Bolsheviks. The Civil War was brutal and chaotic. Millions died from combat, famine, disease, and terror. Both sides committed atrocities. The Bolsheviks created the Cheka, a secret police force that carried out the Red Terror, executing tens of thousands of suspected enemies. The Whites engaged in their own terror, including pogroms against Jews. In July 1918, the Bolsheviks executed Nicholas II and his entire family in Yekaterinburg, where they had been held captive. The execution was kept secret initially, but became known later. Leon Trotsky, the Bolshevik Commissar for War, organized the Red Army from scratch, using both committed revolutionaries and former Tsarist officers held in line by political commissars. Through ruthless discipline, mass mobilization, and effective use of Russia's railway network, Trotsky created a formidable fighting force. By 1920, the Bolsheviks had won. The White armies were defeated one by one. Foreign interventions ended. Nationalist movements in Ukraine and elsewhere were crushed. The Bolsheviks controlled most of the former Russian Empire, though Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states remained independent. But victory came at an enormous cost. The economy was shattered. The policy of war communism, which involved forcible grain requisitions and nationalization of almost all industry, had brought production to a fraction of pre-war levels. Famine was widespread. In 1921, a famine in the Volga region killed millions. In 1921, sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, once staunch Bolshevik supporters, rebelled, demanding political freedom and economic relief. The rebellion was crushed, but it showed that discontent extended even to the revolution's original supporters. Lenin responded with the new economic policy, or NEP, in 1921. This partially restored market mechanisms, allowing peasants to sell their surplus grain and permitting small private businesses. The economy began to recover, but politically, the Bolsheviks tightened their grip. Other socialist parties were banned. Factions within the Bolshevik Party were forbidden. The secret police continued to operate. The foundation was laid for a one-party dictatorship. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, was formally established, uniting Russia with Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia. Other republics would be added later. The Russian Empire had been replaced by the Soviet Union. Lenin suffered a series of strokes starting in 1922 and died in January 1924. His death triggered a power struggle that Joseph Stalin would eventually win, leading to an era of terror and transformation that would define the Soviet Union for decades. Stalin's revolution from above. Joseph Stalin, born Ioseb Jugashvili in Georgia, had been a long-time Bolshevik, though not one of the most prominent. He held the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party, which seemed like an administrative role but gave him control over party appointments. Through the 1920s, Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals, including Leon Trotsky, eventually emerging as the undisputed leader by the late 1920s. Stalin's vision was to transform the Soviet Union into a modern industrial power through rapid, forced industrialization and the collectivization of agriculture. In 1928, he launched the first 5-year plan, setting ambitious targets for industrial production. Entire new cities and industrial complexes were built. Heavy industry, particularly steel, coal and machinery, was prioritized. The pace was breakneck and the human cost was enormous. Workers lived in terrible conditions, were subjected to intense propaganda, and faced severe punishment for failing to meet quotas. even more traumatic was collectivization. Starting in 1929, Stalin ordered the collectivization of agriculture, forcing peasants to give up their individual farms and join collective farms, or kolkhozes. The goal was to extract more grain, to feed industrial workers, and for export, and to break the power of the more prosperous peasants called kulaks. Peasants resisted fiercely. They slaughtered their livestock rather than hand them over. In response, the regime used brutal force. Kulaks were liquidated as a class, meaning they were executed, sent to labor camps, or deported to remote areas. Millions of peasants suffered this fate. The disruption caused by collectivization, combined with excessive grain requisitions, led to a catastrophic famine in 1932 and 1933, particularly severe in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia. The famine in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor, killed millions. Whether it was an intentional genocide or a consequence of callous and incompetent policies remains debated, but there is no doubt it was a human catastrophe of staggering proportions. By the mid-1930s, Stalin had achieved his goals of industrialization and collectivization, at least in a basic sense. The Soviet Union had become an industrial power, but the cost in human life and suffering was almost incalculable. Then, from 1936 to 1938, Stalin unleashed the Great Terror. In a series of show trials, old Bolshevik leaders confessed to absurd charges of treason and were executed. But the terror extended far beyond the leadership. The secret police, now called the NKVD, arrested millions on vague charges of being enemies of the people, spies, or saboteurs. Many were executed. Millions more were sent to the Gulag, the system of forced labor camps that stretched across the Soviet Union. The terror struck all levels of society. Party officials, military officers, intellectuals, workers, peasants, and ethnic minorities. Entire nationalities were deported. The military was particularly hard hit, with much of the officer corps executed or imprisoned, leaving the Red Army weakened on the eve of World War II. The Great Terror subsided by 1939, but Stalin's dictatorship remained absolute. The Soviet Union had become a totalitarian state where Stalin's word was law, where all aspects of life were controlled by the party, and where dissent meant death or the Gulag. World War II and the Great Patriotic War. In August 1939, the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with Nazi Germany. The pact included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe between the two powers. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, starting World War II, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, occupying eastern Poland. The Soviets also invaded Finland in the Winter War of 1939-40, eventually gaining territory after fierce Finnish resistance. In 1940, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states and Bessarabia, expanding its territory and bringing millions more people under Soviet rule. But on June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. German forces, numbering over 3 million men, along with Finnish, Romanian, and other allies, attacked along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The initial phase of the invasion was catastrophic for the Soviet Union. The The Red Army, weakened by the purges and caught by surprise despite warnings, was thrown back in disarray. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in vast encirclement battles. By autumn 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad and had overrun much of Ukraine. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. The government evacuated factories and workers eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers. Production of tanks, planes and weapons continued in the Urals and Siberia. The brutal Russian winter set in, and German forces, inadequately prepared, suffered terribly. Soviet resistance stiffened. In December 1941, the Red Army counterattacked at Moscow, driving the Germans back. It was the first major German defeat of the war. The war entered a grinding phase in 1942. German forces renewed their offensive in the south, aiming for the oil fields of the Caucasus. The decisive battle would be fought at Stalingrad. From August 1942 to February 1943, Soviet and German forces fought for control of Stalingrad, a city on the Volga. The battle was one of the bloodiest in history, with over 2 million casualties. Fighting was often hand-to-hand in ruins and rubble. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a counter-offensive, encircling the German Sixth Army. Despite Hitler's orders to fight to the last man, the German commander surrendered in February 1943. Stalingrad was a turning point. Germany would never fully recover. In July 1943, the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, saw the Soviets defeat another German offensive. From then on, the Red Army was almost constantly on the attack, pushing westward. Soviet forces liberated Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, though often at enormous cost. They entered Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. In April 1945, they reached Berlin. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. On May 9th, Germany surrendered. The Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the war in Europe. Over 27 million Soviet citizens died, more than half of them civilians. Entire cities and regions were devastated. The western parts of the country were in ruins. But the Soviet Union emerged from the war as one of the two superpowers, along with the United States. Soviet forces occupied much of Eastern Europe. Stalin was determined to create a buffer zone of friendly governments, which led to the imposition of communist regimes in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. The Cold War had begun. The Cold War era. The period from 1945 to 1991 was dominated by the Cold War, the ideological, political, and sometimes military struggle between the Soviet-led communist bloc and the Western democracies led by the United States. After Stalin died in March 1953, there was a brief power struggle. Nikita Khrushchev emerged as leader by 1955. In 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered a secret speech denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and some of his crimes. This de-Stalinization was limited and inconsistent, but it did lead to the release of many Gulag prisoners and a slight relaxation of censorship and repression. Khrushchev's era, from the mid-1950s to 1964, was marked by a mix of reform attempts and international crises. Khrushchev promised that the Soviet Union would surpass the United States economically, and that communism would be achieved within a generation. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, shocking the world and beginning the space race. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, another Soviet triumph. But Khrushchev's domestic policies were often erratic. His agricultural schemes, like planting corn in unsuitable climates and his Virgin Lands campaign in Kazakhstan, had mixed results. His cultural policies vacillated between thaw and freeze. Internationally, Khrushchev's tenure saw major crises. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 divided Berlin and became a symbol of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war when the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba. After a tense standoff, Khrushchev backed down, agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for a US promise not to invade Cuba and the quiet removal of US missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev was ousted in October 1964 by his colleagues in the Politburo, who found him too unpredictable. He was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who led the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982. The Brezhnev era is often characterized as one of stagnation. Economic growth slowed. The initial enthusiasm for communist ideals faded into cynicism and conformity. The system became increasingly corrupt and sclerotic. Dissidents like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn criticized the regime, facing harassment, imprisonment, or exile. Brezhnev pursued détente with the West in the 1970s, signing arms-control treaties like SALT I. But the Soviet Union also maintained a massive military, engaged in an arms race with the United States, and intervened in various Third World conflicts. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support a communist government there. The invasion turned into a long, costly quagmire. The Soviet military struggled against Afghan Mujahideen guerrillas, supported by the United States and Pakistan. The war dragged on for nearly 10 years, costing thousands of Soviet lives and contributing to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev died in November 1982. His successors, Yuri Andropov and then Konstantin Chernenko, were elderly and in poor health, ruling briefly. Real change would come with Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev, perestroika, and the end of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985 at the age of 54, relatively young by Soviet leadership standards. He was intelligent, energetic, and aware that the Soviet system was in deep crisis. The economy was stagnant, technology was lagging, the war in Afghanistan was a disaster, and the population was demoralized. Gorbachev introduced two key policies: glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. Glasnost meant greater freedom of expression, a loosening of censorship, and more open discussion of problems. Perestroika meant economic reforms, attempting to introduce some market mechanisms while maintaining socialism. These policies unleashed forces Gorbachev could not control. As censorship lifted, criticisms of the system poured out. Historical crimes, like Stalin's terror and the true costs of collectivization, were openly discussed. Nationalities began to demand greater autonomy or independence. In the Baltic states, in the Caucasus, in Ukraine, nationalist movements grew. Economically, perestroika failed. The reforms were half-hearted and contradictory, disrupting the old system without creating a functional new one. Shortages worsened. The government's budget deficit soared. In international relations, Gorbachev pursued rapprochement with the West. He met with US President Ronald Reagan and later George H.W. Bush, signing arms reduction treaties. In 1989, he allowed the communist regimes in Eastern Europe to fall without Soviet intervention. The Berlin Wall came down in November 1989. By the end of the year, communist governments across Eastern Europe had collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet Union was disintegrating. Republics declared independence or sovereignty. In August, hardline communists attempted a coup, placing Gorbachev under house arrest and trying to restore the old order. But the coup collapsed after 3 days, thanks in part to resistance led by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, who stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament and rallied opposition. The failed coup discredited the Communist Party and accelerated the breakup. One by one, Soviet republics declared independence. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin, and the Russian tricolour was raised. The Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Post-Soviet Russia, Yeltsin and the transition. The 1990s were a tumultuous decade for Russia. Boris Yeltsin, who had been elected president of the Russian Republic in 1991, now led an independent Russia. The transition to a market economy and democracy was chaotic and painful. Yeltsin pursued shock therapy economic reforms, rapidly privatizing state enterprises and lifting price controls. The result was economic collapse. Hyperinflation wiped out people's savings. Production plummeted. Unemployment soared. A small group of well-connected individuals, the so-called oligarchs, acquired state assets at bargain prices, becoming fabulously wealthy while most of the population struggled. Crime and corruption flourished. The state weakened, unable to pay its employees or maintain services. Life expectancy dropped. Birth rates fell. Many Russians looked back on the Soviet era with nostalgia, remembering stability and security, even if those came with repression. Politically, Russia struggled to build democratic institutions. Yeltsin's relationship with the parliament was contentious. In October 1993, this conflict erupted into violence when Yeltsin ordered tanks to shell the parliament building after legislators tried to remove him from power. Yeltsin won, but democracy was damaged. A new constitution was adopted in December 1993, giving the president enormous powers. Yeltsin was re-elected in 1996 in a controversial campaign heavily backed by the oligarchs and marked by media manipulation. Russia also faced a brutal conflict in Chechnya, a small republic in the North Caucasus. When Chechnya declared independence in 1991, Russia initially did little. But in December 1994, Yeltsin sent troops to restore Russian control. The First Chechen War lasted until 1996 and was a disaster. Russian forces, poorly trained and equipped, suffered heavy casualties. Chechen guerrillas fought effectively. Eventually, Russia agreed to a ceasefire that left Chechnya's status unresolved. By the late 1990s, Yeltsin's health was failing, and his popularity had collapsed. In August 1998, Russia defaulted on its debts, causing a financial crisis. The political system was in chaos, with prime ministers changing frequently. On December 31st, 1999, in a surprise move, Yeltsin resigned and handed power to his prime minister, a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. Yeltsin asked the Russian people to forgive him for his failures. It was the end of an era. Putin's Russia: centralization and assertiveness. Vladimir Putin became acting president on January 1st, 2000, and was elected president in March 2000. Putin was young by Russian leadership standards, only 47, reserved, and little known outside security circles. But he would dominate Russian politics for the next 2 decades and beyond. Putin promised to restore order and state authority after the chaos of the 90s. He moved systematically to centralize power. Regional governors, who had been elected, were now effectively appointed by the Kremlin. Independent media outlets were taken over by state-friendly owners or shut down. The oligarchs were given a choice: stay out of politics and keep your wealth, or challenge the Kremlin and face prosecution. Those who chose the latter, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, were imprisoned and their assets seized. The economy recovered dramatically in the 2000s, driven largely by high oil and gas prices. Russia was one of the world's largest energy producers, and rising global demand for hydrocarbons brought enormous revenues. Living standards improved, salaries were paid on time, pensions increased. A middle class emerged in the major cities. Putin's approval ratings soared. In foreign policy, Putin sought to restore Russia's status as a great power. He was critical of Western expansion of NATO eastward and of Western interventions in the Balkans and the Middle East. In 2008, when Georgia tried to retake its breakaway region of South Ossetia by force, Russia intervened militarily, defeating Georgian forces in a brief war and recognizing the independence of South Ossetia and another breakaway region, Abkhazia. In 2014, after Ukraine's pro-Russian president was overthrown in a revolution, Russia annexed Crimea, a Ukrainian peninsula with a Russian-speaking majority and home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Russia also supported separatists in eastern Ukraine, leading to a conflict that continued for years. These actions led to Western sanctions and a deterioration in Russia-West relations. But domestically, the annexation of Crimea was popular, further boosting Putin's approval. Putin served 2 terms as president from 2000 to 2008. The constitution limited presidents to 2 consecutive terms, so in 2008, Putin became prime minister while his protege Dmitry Medvedev became president. But everyone understood Putin remained the real power. In 2012, Putin returned to the presidency, and the presidential term was extended from 4 to 6 years. Under Putin, Russia became increasingly authoritarian. Political opposition was marginalized through legal restrictions, harassment, and occasional violence. Protests were suppressed. Civil society organizations faced pressure. The state controlled most major media. Economically, Russia remained heavily dependent on oil and gas exports. When oil prices fell in 2014 and Western sanctions were imposed, the economy suffered. Attempts to diversify and modernize had limited success. Corruption remained endemic. In 2020, constitutional amendments were passed allowing Putin to potentially remain president until 2036. The amendments were approved in a referendum marked by widespread reports of irregularities. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, calling it a special military operation. The invasion, justified by Russian claims about NATO expansion and threats to Russian speakers, was widely condemned internationally. Ukraine, supplied with Western weapons, mounted fierce resistance. The war became a grinding conflict with enormous casualties on both sides and massive destruction in Ukraine. Western countries imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, attempting to isolate it economically and diplomatically. The war had profound implications for Russia's future, its relationships with the West, and the global order. As of the end of 2024, the conflict continued with no clear resolution in sight. Reflections on 1,000 years. And so we come to the end of our long journey through Russian history, from the earliest Eastern Slavic tribes to the present day. We've travelled through over 1,000 years, witnessing the rise and fall of dynasties, the expansion of an empire across continents, revolutions, wars, and transformations. Russia's history is marked by certain recurring themes. The tension between Westernization and traditional Russian identity, a debate that began with Peter the Great and continues today. The pattern of authoritarian rule, with brief interludes of reform or liberalization, usually followed by retrenchment. The cycles of expansion and consolidation as Russia grew to become the largest country on earth by area. The terrible human costs of modernization, war, and political repression. Throughout this history, we see the resilience of the Russian people, surviving invasions, famines, purges, and wars that killed tens of millions. We see remarkable cultural achievements in literature, music, art, and science. We see a country that has been both European and Asian, neither fully one nor the other, occupying a unique position geographically and culturally. From the medieval Principality of Kiev to the Mongol Yoke, from the rise of Moscow to the Empire of the Romanovs, from the revolutionary upheavals of 1917 to the Soviet experiment, from the chaos of the 90s to Putin's Russia, the story of this vast land and its people is one of the great dramas of human history. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can imagine those endless forests where the first Slavic tribes made their homes, the onion domes of Orthodox churches gleaming in the snow, the vast steppes where horsemen once rode, the palaces of St. Petersburg reflected in the canals, the factories and collective farms of the Soviet era, the modern cities of today. Russia's future remains uncertain, shaped by its complex past, its current challenges, and the choices of its people and leaders. But one thing is certain: the history of Russia, with all its grandeur and tragedy, its achievements and its horrors, will continue to fascinate and instruct those who study it. Thank you for joining us on this journey through sleepless history. May these stories carry you gently into restful sleep, and may you wake refreshed, perhaps with a deeper appreciation for the long, winding paths that human societies travel through time. Sleep well.